Hey everyone, I'm RRabbits, welcome back to my channel and welcome to Monster Analysis. Up for analysis today is Hirondeleor. Hirondeleor doesn't have any natural predators left since he killed them all. However, now he's gotten greedy and he also wants to destroy the only creature that can pose a threat to him, any Pyast. And so Hirondeleor is one of the newest monsters from the Monstershore island, and overall I'm not a fan of this monster design. However, I am a fan of this monster's stats, skills, and traits, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Before we jump into the actual analysis, you should know that as of the time I'm recording this video, there's a total of 35 Dark Legendary monsters, so there's plenty of competition in the Dark elements, and so I'm going to be comparing Hirondeleor to the rest of these monsters. And so we start things off with power. 3,553 is actually the second highest power for Dark monsters. It's second only to Balthasar, and it's only off by a few points, so an extremely powerful monster so far. And if having a high power wasn't enough for this monster, he also has a pretty tanky life of 30,461, which actually puts him in 7th place in the Dark element, tied with Master Skill and Dr. Hazard. So not only does he have a high power, the second highest power actually, he also has a nice tanky life. And once again, if that wasn't enough, this monster also has a pretty good speed, 3,454, this puts him in 14th place, tied with War Razorface and Fenrir. And you might be thinking that 14th place isn't that high, it just so happens that there's so many monsters in the Dark element that have a speed of 3,465, and that's why he's down in 14th place. You should know however that the speed stat itself, 3,454, this is actually the 6th highest stat in the Dark element. So overall in a nutshell, considering there's 35 Dark Legendary monsters, this monster's stats are well above average. And if it wasn't enough for this monster to have amazing stats, take a look at his trait. It is Hardened. All status effects have a 20% less accuracy against it. In my opinion, Hardened is becoming the superior trait for regular monsters to have. I say regular monsters because there's obviously the generals that have the tough trait, which is 35% less accuracy, and then there's the VIP monsters and the keeper that have bulwark, which is 50% less accuracy. But if you're a regular monster, in my opinion, having Harden is the best trait you can have now, because especially in the dark category, Krampus can freeze you, plenty of dark monsters like Mommy and Will Razorface, they can stun you, and then don't even get me started with possession. There's so many monsters that can possess you, so it doesn't matter what immunity you have. And even if you have something like immunity to possession, Glitch is also a dark monster that can do corruption. Corruption actually bypasses possession. So whatever trait immunity you have in the dark element, you're really not safe, which is why it's better to have Hardened. And if you have Hardened, you also by default become a really good monster to put on defense, because typically the method is to deny the enemy monsters, that way they can't attack you, and then you can attack with your monsters. Well, if your defensive team has Hardened monsters, there's a chance they can't rely on that strategy, there's a chance they can't deny you, and then maybe your AI can get lucky and get an ultimate, or maybe you can just do the right attack against the right monster and kill that monster. There are just so many benefits to having Hardened as a trait. So overall this monster has amazing stats and an amazing trait. So anyways, now let's dive into the skills. The ultimate skill is called Salamas. Deals very heavy special damage to all enemies, may make all targets bleed, may give nightmares to all targets. His ultimate attack is a dark based attack that deals 65 damage to all of the enemy monsters. It also applies bleeding and nightmares. Together, bleeding and nightmares will take away 15% of the enemy's health for the next 3 turns. Now there are a few monsters immune to nightmares, especially dark monsters, but there's currently no monster in the game immune to bleeding. And on top of that, bleeding will also reduce the enemy's damage output by 20%, and nightmares, on that first initial turn, it will take away 10% of stamina from the enemy monster. On a legendary monster, that's like 14 stamina. And so I personally would have preferred if this was a special based attack as opposed to a dark based attack, that way you have no problem taking on the dark monster with your ultimate. However, if you ever happen to face off against an earth monster, then this ultimate attack is really powerful because you have the elemental advantage. And even then, earth monsters tend to be tanky, maybe they even have life runes. So if you were to use your ultimate against an earth monster and they were to survive, one, they have bleeding and nightmares, which is going to take away 15% of their health. So as long as your ultimate attack can take away 85% of their health, bleeding and nightmares will do the rest. And even if they happen to survive for whatever reason, thanks to bleeding, their damage output is reduced. So overall, it's a pretty good ultimate attack, especially for an attacker monster like Hirondeleor. There's nothing really promising in skills group 1, so on to skills group 2 we go. And so we start things off with Adductor Mandibulae. Deals very heavy special damage, may make target bleed, requires cooldown. Here we have a special based attack that deals 65 damage, 31 stamina cost, 2 turn cooldown, and it applies bleeding. What can I say other than wow? Given this monster's power, given some strength runes, given the damage output of the skill 65, this skill has the potential to one-hit the enemy monster, and once again, if they happen to survive for whatever reason, bleeding will take care of the rest, and if that monster does die because of bleeding, because of a DOT, the next monster in the turn order will be skipped, so you can use that to your advantage. And I would have to say that without a doubt, this is a must-have skill on this monster. Next up is Underwater Karis. Deals very heavy dark damage, may give nightmares to target, requires cooldown. So this skill is a dark based attack that deals 60 damage, 31 stamina cost, 2 turn cooldown, and it applies nightmares. Now compared to Adductor, it's weaker in 2 regards. It's weaker because the damage output is 60 as opposed to 65, and instead of bleeding, it only gives nightmares, which takes away 5% less HP every turn, and not to mention the fact that some monsters are actually immune to nightmares. But the one place this skill actually outshines Adductor is if you were to face off against an earth monster, because then you would get that elemental advantage. But other than that, Adductor is really the way to go. If you're deciding between these two skills, I would recommend the special base skill obviously, and at the same time it's still possible to run both of these single hit skills, because if you were to use Adductor against an enemy and take him out in one hit, on the next turn you can use Underwater to take out the other enemy in one hit, the other non-dark monster, so it's definitely valid to use both of these skills. And that's actually normally what I like to do with my builds. If I know I have a monster that can one hit the enemy monster, I really don't think it's useful to run lots of AoEs. I think it's useful to run just 2 single target hits that can one hit the enemy monsters, but in this case I'm actually not going to be recommending that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so anyways, next up is Deep Cold Waters. Gains damage boost and immunity to freeze, requires cooldown. So this is a self skill that costs 28 stamina, has a 1 turn cooldown, and it gives you freeze immunity for 3 turns, and it also gives you a damage boost, which means all of your attacks are 50% stronger. And so I'm a huge fan of this skill for several reasons. First of all, it gives you freeze immunity. That's really nice if you ever face off against water monsters, if you ever face off against Krampus. If your deny monster happens to deny Krampus on the first turn, but Krampus is still alive, you may want to use Deep Cold Waters to protect yourself from getting frozen, if your deny monster can't deny Krampus the next turn. And on top of being protected from frozen, you also get a nice damage boost, which means your next attack is definitely gonna kill. But the second reason I'm a huge fan of this skill is because it's a self skill. Anytime you have a self skill, that's the same thing as being immune to possession, because let's just say you happen to be possessed. Yeah, sure, you could recharge, but instead of recharging, you could also use your self skill. So not only were you possessed and you protected yourself from attacking your teammates, so let's say you do get denied and you get possessed, that doesn't matter because now you protect yourself from being frozen and you give yourself a damage boost for the next turn. This is really amazing, I think. Yeah, you have hardened, so you may not always get frozen or you may not always get possessed, but in the case that it does happen, this is a really great skill to have, another must-have skill in my opinion. And anyways, now we move on to skills group 3, Piranha Shoal. Deals moderate special damage to all enemies, may make all targets bleed, requires cooldown. Here we have a special based attack that deals 40 damage to all of the enemy monsters, 37 stamina cost, 2 turn cooldown, and it applies bleeding. Wow, this is just phenomenal. Given this monster's power, given the fact that it's a 40 special based attack that also applies bleeding, this is such a powerful deadly AoE on this monster. Yet again, this is a must-have skill. I don't think this requires further explanation. And speaking of powerful AoEs, we have Shadows in the Shore. Deals moderate dark damage to all enemies, may give nightmares to all targets, requires cooldown. So here we have a dark based AoE, this time that deals 45 damage to all of the enemy monsters, 37 stamina cost, 2 turn cooldown, and this time it gives nightmares. So the advantage over Piranha is that it has 5 more damage, however the disadvantage is that it gives nightmares instead of bleeding, and once again it's dark based. Against a dark monster that's not helpful, then again against an earth monster that is helpful. So there's pros and cons to running either of these skills, however my preference goes to Piranha. However, that being said, it is possible to run both of these skills, and that's actually what I'm going to recommend. Run Piranha and run Shadows in the Shore, along with Deep Cold Waters and Adductor. But before we completely move on to talking about skill sets, let's talk about the last skill in skill group 3, Warm River Flow. Gains double damage, requires cooldown. Here we have another self skill that costs 25 stamina cost, 1 turn cooldown, and you just give yourself double damage. In my opinion, it's not a really great skill. Sure, it's another skill that helps you against being possessed, but just double damage, that's it? No increased accuracy, no something else? Like, don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily bad, especially because you're such a powerful monster. Can you imagine if you were to get possessed, use Warm River Flow, then Piranha? That is going to kill all of the enemy monsters guaranteed. That's like stronger than your ultimate attack, and there's no elemental restriction to it. But still, I don't really think Warm River Flow is that worth it, and if you're deciding between Warm River Flow and Deep Cold Waters, I just think that freeze immunity and damage boost has a better advantage. But then again, at the same time, it really depends on what kind of war you're in, because if you're in a war where no one can freeze you, if you look at the 3 enemy monsters on defense and none of them have freeze skills, well then you really don't need Deep Cold Waters. If you're in a team wars where they can only possess you, then having Warm River Flow will come in handy, because all you're getting here is a damage boost and immunity to freeze, but immunity to freeze won't help you out. So it's ultimately up to you whether you want to run Warm River Flow or if you want to run Deep Cold Waters. I give you the pros and cons to each. Personally, I think I would go with Deep Cold Waters just to be prepared for more scenarios, but again, like I just mentioned, all you have to do is put yourself in a scenario where no one can freeze you, in which case Warm River Flow becomes a superior skill. And with that being said, my recommended skill set would be Adductor, Deep Cold Waters, Shadows in the Shore, and Piranha. And normally I wouldn't do this, normally I wouldn't recommend 2 AoEs, just because most of the time you could probably use Adductor to one-hit the enemy dark monster, or any monster really, and then use Underwater Karis to take out the enemy non-dark monster, but in this specific case, I just think Piranha Shoal is such a good skill that's definitely worth using, potentially on your first turn, and if you do Piranha, maybe it's better to use Shadows in the Shore instead of having 2 single target hits, so that's why this is my recommended skill set. One thing you can do if you're planning to use this monster on defense is to use Shadows in the Shore, Piranha, Adductor, and Underwater. That way no matter what skill the AI does, it's still going to be a powerful skill. Especially if you give this monster at least 2 strength runes, because it's pretty much an AI proof skill. Because you have hardened, there's a 20% chance you won't get immobilized, so then can you imagine if the AI does Shadows in the Shore? That's going to be really powerful. Piranha, that's going to be really powerful too. Abductor, that may one-hit one of the enemy monsters. Underwater, that may also one-hit one of the enemy monsters. So if you want to go for a defensive build, that's one option. And you can also even use the skill set on an offensive build. You won't have your self skill, so you won't have your fuse immunity or your damage boost or your what's essentially an immunity to possession, but if you put yourself in a scenario where you can be possessed, then it may be worth having this skill set just to have a monster for offense and for defense. And so I can't really say what's the best skill set because it really differs on a player to player basis. Some of you only care about offense and not so much about defense, others care about defense more, others may have better alternatives for defense and for offense, so it really depends on your own individual circumstance. And so this video is the best advice I can give you guys. So with that being said, I would have to say that overall Hirondeleor is a pretty good addition to the Dark Monsters. He's quite a powerful one at that. Really great for offense, also really great for defense, just an overall really great monster. And so anyways, that's my opinion on Hirondeleor. Now I want to hear from all of you guys. What do you guys think about this monster? How do you think he compares to the other dark monsters, specifically to the dark attackers? Seriously, how do you think he matches up against them? Is he as good? Is he not as good? Let me know in the comments below. With that being said, I'm RRabbits, and like always, remember to dream big and pursue your passions.